I know you suffered a very significant injury during your time in the Navy. Can you talk about how that changed you and what the road to recovery, what you learned about yourself?
Yeah. So I was in the SEAL teams in the late 1990s, and there wasn't a whole lot of work going around in the 90s. And by work, the only thing that matters to a SEAL is combat. So I suffered two major head injuries. The first one was during a training exercise, military operations in an urban terrain, mountain training. It's just what you saw on TV in Iraq, going from house to house to house. And so it was at night. And remember back then, you know, walking around with night vision goggles and the laser scopes didn't exist. You had iron sights and you had a flashlight mounted on your weapon. And when you wanted to see, you hit the flashlight, right? So we were going in through a door, and I was the number two man in the door, and the first guy jumped really aggressively to the right. And I remember thinking, well, that's weird. That's not a standard flow movement that we do. And I understood very quickly why he did that, right? I went the opposite way he did, and there was no floor on the other side of the door. So I took a full story, whatever that is, 10 or 12 feet onto the concrete, wham, right on my head. Now, back in those days, again, head injuries and injuries in general were handled a little differently, for better, for worse, probably for worse. It was kind of hey, Errol, your skull is showing. What do you want to do? And I was like, well, let's just clean it up. Let's finish the training. We'll get to the local hospital. We'll get some stitches and move back to work. That's the way it is. That's the way it was. It turns out that a couple of weeks later, I had this terrible incident where I was immobile because the pain was so bad in my head. Nobody could figure out what was wrong. They did multiple spinal taps on me over the course of a week. What we know now was my brain was swelling and bleeding and coming down into my spine. Once I had a clean spinal tap, I was in the hospital for a week. They discharged me. Command called, I'm like, hey, you ready to come back to work on Monday? I'm like, yeah, I'm ready. You know what I mean? So it was different. The next injury was we were on deployment and we got tasked with an operation. And it was what's called a visit board search and seizure, right? A ship takedown, classic Navy SEAL operation. Absolutely nobody in the world does it better than we do. And we had a 24-hour, it was in 48 hours. So we had a day to rehearse. And did you ever watch Seinfeld? You never watched the show Seinfeld? Well, there's a very funny, epic line from this character, George. And he says, the sea was angry that day, my friend, like an old man trying to deliver, return soup at a deli. And the sea was angry that day. We were over there looking, me and my platoon, and when a bunch of SEALs look at the water and go, I don't know if we can do our operation, that says a lot about how bad the sea state was. And I said, well, okay, look, we've rolled it over and up. Let's rehearse. The long and short of it, I could go through an hour and rivet you with all the details because it's a fun story. The bottom line is it was a 30-foot climb from our fast boats up to the top of the boat that was going to take over. And this is rehearsal. And the ladder ended up getting hard pointed at both ends. And so the sea state was so big that when it went down to the crest of the wave, the trough of the wave, the ladder exploded. And I took a 30-foot header into the boat. So that I got medically discharged after that, but not because of my head injuries, but because of my arm, like my ulnar nerve got shattered, right? So I didn't have use of my hand and they didn't know if I'd get it back. So, I got discharged. But what I kept telling them was, I almost don't care about my hand. I'm like, these headaches, they won't stop. And they're like, oh, I don't know. Well, it was only a couple of years ago, I finally got diagnosed with traumatic brain injury. And so I went through 20 plus years suffering the effects of this injury. And what I know, and I didn't know it at the time, right? So what I know now was the doctor told me based on the scans, he said, look, the part of your brain that's responsible for regulating your emotional response is dormant. It's not working. That's how bad your injury was. And he was like, you really should not be a productive member of society. And in all likelihood, you could have been one of those 22 veterans a day that's committed suicide. Because how did you do this? How did you survive? And we'll get into my leadership practice and all that, but it was essentially this leadership practice that I developed, part and parcel to survive these situations that I would find myself in, and how do I get through them without being overly emotional, and how do I kind of reset my nervous system and all these things. So I went through 25 years of just absolute struggle on processing emotions. And I know towards the end, I was getting progressively worse because my wife said things started to change. Like, you just started to be different. And I got this treatment. It's a non-pharmaceutical treatment that my mission now is to make this the go-to treatment for all brain injuries. It's not FDA approved yet. I'm working on helping the researchers get funding, but it's disgusting that there is a cure out there for this traumatic brain injury that is essentially insulin to create energy in your brain. And we're still giving our veterans, and really quite anybody who's had a head injury, all these pharmaceuticals, and the effects of these pharmaceuticals are making things worse for them, not better. So I've kind of gone off track a little bit, but those were my injuries, and that's what I went through until just recently, until the last couple of years, where my brain is healed.